The candles had been lit for an hour when the woman in the patched gray gown came up the steps of Wexmere House, and not one of the 300 guests below knew that she had once owned the very floor they stood upon. She came alone, without a footman, without a card, her boots worn pale at the toe, and her hem darkened where it had dragged through 3 counties of November mud. A young woman watched her from the gallery above, hands gone still on the cold iron rail, and felt something turn over in her chest that she could not yet name. Below, the orchestra played. Above, the older woman lifted her chin as though the cold could not reach her, and went in. Eleanor Crane had been at Wexmere for 11 weeks, long enough to learn which stairs creaked and which servants would meet her eye, and she knew at once that the woman in grey did not belong to the world of the ballroom, and yet had once belonged to it more completely than anyone now dancing in it. There was a way of carrying oneself that service could not teach and poverty could not strip. Eleanor had seen it in her own father before the death took him, that refusal to apologize for the space a body occupied, and she saw it now in the stranger's straight back as the woman passed beneath the chandelier and was not announced. To the house, Eleanor was no one of consequence. She was the companion engaged to read to old Lady Marsh in the East Wing, a girl of 23 with a dead father, and a dwindling trunk of mended dresses, brought in on a half-year's wages and a character reference she had half believed she would never be granted. The housekeeper called her the reader when she called her anything. The footmen called her Miss when they wanted something carried. The guests, when they noticed her at all, decided in the space of a glance that she was a poor relation of someone, and looked away. She had learned not to mind the looking away. It was the noticing that cost more. What none of them knew, what Eleanor herself did not yet fully understand, was that the woman in the patched gray gown had been the Duchess of Wexmere for 30 years, and that the engagement they had all gathered to celebrate was her own son's. The Duke of Wexmere stood at the head of the long room beneath his father's portrait, and he had not smiled once. Julian Ashcombe was 34, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked carved rather than born, and gray eyes that moved over the crowd without resting on any face in it. He held a glass he did not drink from. Beside him stood the woman. The evening was meant to bind to him, Lady Sophia Vane, gowned in ice-blue silk, with diamonds at her throat, and she smiled enough for them both. The room had decided, weeks ago, that they made a handsome pair. The room was very often wrong about such things, though it rarely lived long enough to learn it. Eleanor knew the Duke only as a stillness at the edges of the house, a tall figure glimpsed through a library door, a voice low in the hall giving instruction she was not meant to hear. He frightened the maids. He did not frighten her, though she could not have said why. Perhaps it was that grief recognized grief, and she had buried enough of her own to know its shape on another. There was something in the way he stood beneath the portrait, as if the dead man in the frame still ran the house, and the living one merely kept it warm. She turned from the gallery rail to follow the woman in gray because no one else would, and because something in her could not bear to watch a person walk into a room that did not want her, and let her walk in alone. The stranger had stopped at the threshold of the ballroom. From behind, Eleanor saw the way her shoulders set, the small private gathering of courage that costs the most when no one is there to see it spent. Then a voice cut across the music, bright and carrying, the voice of a woman accustomed to being heard. "Good heavens!" said Lady Augusta Ashcombe, the Duke's aunt, turning from her circle with her fan held high. "Someone has let a beggar in off the road. Fetch a footman. We do not feed them at the door at Wexmere, whatever they may do in town." The circle laughed, the soft, cruel laughter of people who are certain of their footing. The woman in gray did not turn. She stood very straight and looked across the candlelit room toward her son, who had not yet seen her. And Eleanor, close enough now to see the older woman's hands, watched those hands tremble once, and then go still by force of will alone. "I am not hungry, Augusta," the woman said. "I came for the music." The fan stopped moving. For one moment Lady Augusta's face did something complicated, a flicker of recognition swiftly buried, and then she laughed again, louder, and said to the room, "Listen to it. The creature knows my name." But Eleanor had seen the flicker, and she understood, all at once and with a cold drop in her stomach, that the woman in gray was not a stranger to this house at all. She was known. She was known, and she was being unknown, on purpose, in front of 300 people, by someone who had every reason to wish her gone. The Duke turned then. Across the length of the room, beneath his father's portrait, with his betrothed's gloved hand on his sleeve, Julian Ashcombe looked at the woman in the patched gray gown, and the glass in his hand did not fall, but his knuckles went white around it, and the whole composed architecture of his face shifted by a degree that only someone watching closely would have caught. Eleanor was watching closely. She saw it. She saw a man recognize his mother dressed as a pauper in his own ballroom, and she saw him not move. That was the moment the evening broke open, though it would take the rest of the night to spill. Eleanor's place at Wexmere had come to her through a chain of small mercies, and one large humiliation. Her father had been a gentleman of modest acres in Hertfordshire, a man who loved his books more than his lectures, and when he died in the spring he left her a name without money to keep it, and a house already pledged to his creditors. She had sold the furniture. She had sold the horses. She had sold, last of all and weeping, the small pianoforte at which her mother had taught her to play before the fever took her, and she had stood in the emptied morning room and understood that she was now a woman who must work or starve. Such women did not, in the ordinary way of things, end in the great houses. They ended in shabby lodgings, mending other women's gloves. Yet old Lady Marsh, a cousin of her late mother, had remembered the girl who once played for her at Christmas, and had sent for her, and Eleanor had come to Wexmere with one trunk and the determination to give no one cause to send her away again. She had made herself useful and invisible, which at Wexmere were nearly the same thing. She read to Lady Marsh in the mornings, walked the old woman in the gardens when the weather allowed, and in the long afternoons she was free, and in the freedom she had found the library. It was a tall, dim, candle-smelling room, 2 stories of books reached by a wheeled ladder, and the first time she entered it, she had stood in the doorway and breathed, and felt almost like a person again. She thought no one used it. She was wrong. The Duke used it at dawn. She discovered this on her 9th day, when she crept down before the house had woken to return a volume of poems, and found him standing at the window in his shirt-sleeves with a letter in his hand, his back to her, the gray light making a hard line of his shoulders. She had stopped. She should have gone. Even so, he had heard her, and turned, and for a moment they had simply looked at one another across the cold room, the servant girl and the silent Duke, and he had not ordered her out. "You read Cowper," he had said instead, looking at the book in her hands. "My father read him to me," she had answered, before she could decide to lie. "I find I cannot stop." Something had crossed his face, then, quick as weather. He had folded the letter once, twice, and slid it into the breast of his coat where it lay, and Eleanor had noticed how his hand pressed flat against the fabric for a moment after, as though to be sure the paper was still there, as though it were the only warm thing in the room. Then he had said, his voice level, "Take what you like from these shelves. No one else troubles them." And he had walked out past her close enough that she felt the cold off his coat, and the library had been hers and his ever since, by an arrangement neither of them named. In the weeks that followed, they had met there perhaps a dozen times, always at the gray hour, almost always in silence. She learned the small grammar of him. He took his coffee, black, and let it go cold. He could stand without moving for a quarter of an hour, looking at nothing. He never spoke of the engagement, and the household spoke of nothing else. And once, when she had reached too high for a book, and the ladder had slipped, he had crossed the room in 3 strides and caught the ladder. Not her, his hand flat against the rail an inch below her own, and had said only, "Come down," in the same voice he used for everything, and she had come down. And her heart had been loud in her throat for reasons she told herself were merely the fright of the fall. She had thought herself foolish. A companion did not think of a duke. A duke did not look at a companion. The world had a great many walls in it, and Eleanor had spent her life learning their heights. She had also learned that the body keeps its own counsel, and hers had begun to know precisely where, in any room, the Duke of Wexmere stood, without her eyes being asked at all. Now in the broken hush of the ballroom, she watched him fail to go to his mother, and she did not understand it. The not understanding was its own small grief. It was the rival who moved first. Lady Sophia Vane, sensing the shift in the room as a sailor senses weather, tightened her hand on the Duke's sleeve and said, in a voice pitched to soothe and to claim, "Julian, whoever she is making a scene. Have her removed. You need not trouble yourself." And the Duke looked down at the gloved hand on his arm, as though he had never seen it before. The Duchess crossed the floor herself. She did it slowly. In the patched gray gown, past the diamonds and the silks and the turned shoulders, and the orchestra faltered and recovered and faltered again. And 300 people made the small adjustments of a crowd that does not know whether it is about to witness a charity or a catastrophe. She stopped before her son. She was a head shorter than he, and her hair beneath its plain cap had gone white at the temples, and she looked up at him with eyes the same gray as his own. "You did not write," she said. "For 8 months you did not write. I told myself you did not know where I was. Tonight I see that you simply did not look." And the Duke of Wexmere, before all his guests, said nothing at all. Lady Augusta filled the silence, as people of her kind always will. "She is confused, the poor old thing," she announced, sweeping forward with her fan. "Some former servant, perhaps, dismissed for cause. We shall be very kind and very quick." "James, the side door." A footman started forward. Eleanor, without deciding to, stepped between him and the Duchess and heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt. "She is no servant," Eleanor said. "Look at her. She is no more a servant than you are." The room turned to her, and Eleanor felt the full weight of 300 glances land on her plain gray companion's dress. The cheaper gray beside the Duchess's threadbare gray, and she understood that she had just made herself visible in the worst possible way, and she found that she did not care. Lady Augusta's eyes raked her once. "And who," said the aunt, "is this another stray? The house is full of them tonight. The companion, is it? The reader." She gave the word the same weight one gives a stain. "Go back to your books, girl. This is not your concern, and you are not anyone's concern, which I should think you would have learned by now." The reader? There it was again, the small dismissing word. And Eleanor felt it the way one feels a draft one has stopped troubling to close the window against. Still she did not move, and the Duchess turned and looked at her, really looked, for the first time. And something passed between the two women that had nothing to do with rank, and everything to do with recognition. One dispossessed creature, knowing another across a glittering room. The Duke set down his glass. The small sound of it meeting the table cut through the murmur, and the room hushed for him, as it had not hushed for his mother, because rank is a kind of gravity, and his was the heaviest in the room. He looked at the footman, until the footman stepped back. He looked at his aunt until her fan came down. And then he looked at his mother, and at last he spoke. And what he said was not what anyone expected. "Where have you been living?" he asked. His voice was level. But Eleanor, who knew the levelness now, heard the crack running beneath it like ice over a river. The Duchess did not soften the answer. "In a cottage at Lisle, 2 rooms that your aunt was kind enough to find for me after the reading of your father's will. She explained that the dower house was wanted for repairs. The repairs have taken 19 months. I wrote to you at first. The letters were answered in a hand I did not know, signed with your name. I am told now that you never saw them." She paused. "I came tonight because the notice of your engagement was in the papers, and I read it in a borrowed newspaper at the Lisle posting inn, and I thought, he will not turn his own mother from his door on such a night. I confess I was not certain." A sound went through the crowd, low and uneven. Eleanor watched understanding move across the Duke's face in slow degrees the way water finds the cracks in stone, and she watched him turn, very deliberately to look at his aunt, and she watched Lady Augusta's confident color drain to the gray of the gowns she had been mocking. The story of how a duchess comes to wear rags to her son's engagement is, like most cruelties, a matter of small managements compounded over time. Eleanor would learn the whole of it in the days that followed, partly from the Duchess herself, and partly from the servants who, once the wind had changed, were eager to be remembered as having always known. The shape of it was plain enough by the end of that first night. The old Duke had died 19 months before, suddenly, of a failure of the heart, and his will had been clear and kind. His widow was to have the dower house, an income of £2,000 a year, and the freedom of the estate for her lifetime. The old Duke, however, had named his sister Augusta, a widow herself, with a tongue like a needle and a genius for the appearance of helpfulness, as a trustee of certain moneys during the 8 months that Julian, the new Duke, had been abroad, settling affairs in the family's holdings in the north and on the continent. 8 months. It is astonishing how much can be unmade in 8 months by a person who decides that the order of the world has been arranged incorrectly and that she is the one to correct it. Augusta had not stolen, precisely. She had managed. She had moved the Duchess to Lisle for the dower house repairs that were never quite begun. She had intercepted the correspondence answering the mother's letters to the son in a clerk's hand, and the son's occasional inquiries with assurances that his mother was content in traveling. She had let it be understood, with a sorrowful shake of the head, that the old Duchess had grown strange in her grief, that she wandered, that she was best left quiet in the country. And she had done all of this, Eleanor came to believe, not for money, of which she had enough, but because she had spent her whole life 1 degree from the center of things, and had at last found 8 months in which she could be the center, and could not bear to give it back. But that was the explaining, and it came later. On the night itself there was only the ballroom and the Duke standing between his mother in rags and his aunt in silk, and 300 witnesses, and a companion in a gray dress who had spoken when she should have stayed silent. It was the Duchess who broke the tableau, and she broke it gently. She reached out and took Eleanor's hand, the cold, worn fingers closing over the younger woman's, and she said not loudly, but in a voice the nearest Rose could hear, "This child was the only person in this house tonight to call me by what I am. I do not know her name. I should like to." "Eleanor?" said Eleanor. "Eleanor Crane. I read to Lady Marsh." "Then you are wasted on Lady Marsh," said the Duchess, and something almost like humor touched the corner of her gray eyes. The first warmth in the room. "For Lady Marsh sleeps through the best of the poetry. I have heard her." A few people laughed, and the laughter was different from Augusta's, surprised out of them. On the side of the small against the great, and Eleanor felt the temper of the room begin by the smallest degree to turn. Yet she was looking at the Duke, and the Duke was looking at her hand, held in his mother's hand, and on his carved face there was an expression she had no name for, though she would spend a long time afterward trying to find one. He did not find his voice that night for the thing the room was waiting to hear. He was a man who had been deceived in his own house, who had let his mother be cast out without knowing it, and the shame of it had closed his throat. What he did instead was simpler, and Eleanor thought later, braver for a man so unaccustomed to being seen to feel anything at all. He crossed the small distance to his mother, and he took her other hand, the one Eleanor was not holding, and he raised it to his lips in front of all of them, the dirty, worn fingers of the woman in rags. And he held them there a moment too long, and when he straightened, his eyes were wet, and he did not trouble to hide it. "You will sleep tonight in your own rooms," he said. "Not the dower house. The Duchess's rooms. They were never wanted for repairs." He turned and his gaze found his aunt, and his voice did not rise, which made it worse. "You will wait for me in the morning room. We have a great deal to discuss, and you will find I have grown very interested in correspondence." Lady Sophia Vane, forgotten beside the portrait, said into the hush, "Julian, surely this can wait until your guests have gone." And the Duke looked at her with a courtesy so cold it was nearly an apology, and said, "Nothing about this evening can wait, Lady Sophia. I find I have been too long willing to let things wait." And Eleanor, who had no business hearing any of it, understood that she was watching a man begin to be honest after a long time of not being, and that it was a painful thing to watch, like a limb coming back to life. The party did not recover. Such parties never do. The guests took their carriages early, full of the only thing better than diamonds, which is a story. And by midnight, Wexmere House was emptied of everyone who did not live in it. Eleanor helped the Duchess up the great stair to rooms that had stood shut for 19 months. And a sleepy maid was sent for warming pans and clean linen, and the old woman sat at last in a chair by a fire that someone had finally thought to light, and looked about her at the dust sheets and the cold grate now warming, and said softly, "I had forgot the size of it. One forgets. In 2 rooms, that one was ever large." "You were not made small," Eleanor said, kneeling to build the fire higher. "You were only put in a small place. They are not the same thing." The Duchess looked at her for a long moment. "No," she agreed. "They are not. You are a clever girl," Eleanor craned. "Cleverness is a great inconvenience in a poor woman." "I had it too." She smiled. "Tired. Where is your family?" "Gone," said Eleanor simply. "My father in the spring. My mother some years before. There is no one. There is no one for me either." "Now," said the Duchess, "save a son, I am not sure I know. And a niece, I am very sure I do." She closed her eyes. "Stay until I sleep, if you will. I have grown unused to falling asleep in a room I am not afraid of." Eleanor stayed. She stayed until the old woman's breathing evened, and the fire had caught properly. And then she rose stiff in the knees, and turned to go, and found the Duke standing in the doorway. She did not know how long he had been there. He was looking at his mother asleep in the chair, and then he was looking at Eleanor, and the candle she carried shook a little in her hand. "You should not have spoken tonight," he said. "Augusta will not forgive it. She forgets nothing, and she repays everything." A pause. "I am glad you spoke. Someone had to, Your Grace," Eleanor said. "And you could not. I saw that. I do not think it was cowardice. I think it was the kind of shock that takes the voice." His jaw moved. "You see a great deal for a woman who reads in corners. I have had a great deal of practice at corners," she said. "One learns to watch the room from them." He came into the room then quietly and stood looking down at his sleeping mother, and Eleanor saw his hand rise toward the worn shoulder and stop, and hover, and lower again without touching. A man unpracticed at tenderness reaching for a gesture he had not made in years. "I should have known," he said low, more to himself than to her. "She wrote that she was well. The hand was wrong." I knew the hand was wrong, and I told myself I was tired and reading too much into a clerk's copy. I wanted it to be true that she was. Well, because if it were true, I need not go to her, and I did not want to go. He stopped. "Do you know why I did not want to go?" "No," Eleanor said. He was silent so long she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "Because she looks like my father, and I cannot look at her without looking at him, and I have not been able to look at him since he died." He drew the folded letter from his breast, the same letter, Eleanor realized, that he carried always, and turned it once in his fingers. "This is the last he wrote me. I was in Vienna. He asked me to come home before the winter. I did not." The next letter was from the steward, edged in black. He returned it to his coat, pressed his hand flat over it. "So you see, I am not the wronged party here, whatever the room believed tonight. I left her unprotected because I was a coward about my own grief, and Augusta is only the instrument of a thing I made possible." Eleanor should have said something soothing. It was what a companion was for, the soft word that smoothed the grate over their small discomforts. Instead, she said, "Then go and be braver tomorrow than you were today. The grief will not kill you. I promise you it will not." "Pash." "I have tested it." He looked at her as though she had struck him. And then, astonishingly, the corner of his hard mouth moved, not quite a smile, the ghost of the place. A smile would go. "You are not at all what a companion is meant to be," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "I am told so frequently. Mourning at Wexmere was a reckoning. Eleanor heard only the edges of it, but the edges were enough. Lady Augusta was in the morning room for above an hour, and what passed between aunt and nephew was conducted at a volume too low for the keyhole. But she came out white and rigid, and called for her carriage, and she did not take leave of the Duchess, and she did not look at Eleanor as she swept past her in the hall, except once. A single glance over the shoulder, and in that glance Eleanor read a promise as plain as if it had been spoken. Augusta did not believe herself defeated. She believed herself merely interrupted. The solicitor came that afternoon, a dry, careful man named Mr. Pelham, who had drawn the old Duke's will and had been uneasy for 19 months without knowing precisely why. He spent 3 hours with the Duke and the Duchess and the estate's ledgers, and at the end of it the truth was no longer a thing whispered by servants, but a thing written in a clerk's hand and signed and witnessed. The income diverted, the letters forged, the dower house left to rot on a pretext. It would not go to a court. Great families did not air such things in courts. It was known now, fixed, and the Duchess's rooms were hers again, and her income restored, and the false managements unwound, and Lady Augusta Ashcombe found her invitations in the weeks that followed mysteriously fewer, and the great houses of 3 counties somehow always full when she proposed to call. The hierarchy that had let her work her small cruelty closed over the place where she had stood as water closes over a stone, and that was the only punishment the world handed her, and the Duchess said it was enough, and Eleanor, watching, thought perhaps it was. But none of that was the engagement, and the engagement was the thing the house could not stop turning over, for the Duke had not, in fact, ended it. He had ignored Lady Sophia Vane for 1 whole day, which was its own kind of statement, but the contracts were drawn, the settlements half agreed, and a man of his rank did not simply set aside a betrothal because his mother had come to it in rags. There were 2 great families involved, and lawyers, and a season's worth of expectation, and the cold machinery of it ground on beneath the surface of the warmed house like a river under ice. Lady Sophia was not a stupid woman, and she was not. Eleanor came to see even a cruel one. She was a woman who had been told from the cradle that she was the correct choice, raised and polished and presented for exactly this, and who could no more understand why the Duke's eyes followed a companion across a room than a diamond could understand why anyone would prefer a candle. She watched. She was good at watching, having been watched all her life, and what she watched was the gray hour in the library, which was no longer silent, for Eleanor had kept going down at dawn, and the Duke had kept being there. And now they spoke. They spoke of his father, which he had not done with anyone, and of her father, and of the books, and of the management of grief, on which Eleanor turned out to be the greater authority, though she was 11 years his junior. He told her things in the gray light that he told no one. She told him things she had told no one, since the morning room emptied of her mother's pianoforte. And one morning in the 2nd week, he said, looking at the cold window and not at her, "When I was abroad, I thought I had become a man who felt nothing. I thought my father had taken the part of me that felt with him into the ground. I was almost glad of it. It is a great convenience to feel nothing." He turned. "I find I was mistaken. It is the least convenient thing in the world." Eleanor's heart was loud again in the way she had stopped pretending was the cold or the dark. "Your Grace," she began. "Julian," he said, "in this room, when it is this hour, and there is no one. I am Julian, in this room." He took a step toward her and stopped, the same arrested motion she had seen him make toward his mother's shoulder, a man reaching for what he was not sure he was permitted. "I am going to say a thing I have no right to say. And then I am going to leave the room, and you are not to feel that anything is required of you, because everything in this house is required of you, and I will not be one more thing that requires." He drew breath. "I want you, not as a companion to my mother, not as a kindness. I have a betrothal I must unmake honorably, and a name that complicates everything, and a mother who has only just been restored to me, and none of it changes the single fact, which is that the only hour I am alive in the whole of my day is this one, and it is this one, because you are in it." He stopped. His hand had risen toward her face and hung there an inch from her cheek, not touching. His eyes asking the question his hand would not. "Tell me to go, and I will go." Eleanor did not tell him to go. She stood very still in the gray light, with his hand an inch from her face, and felt the warmth come off his fingers the way she had once felt the cold come off his coat, and she understood that she was standing at the edge of the one thing that, once done, could not be undone. The way the Duchess in rags could not be unseen, and the forged letters could not be unwritten. She thought of all the walls she had spent her life measuring. She thought that she had never once, in measuring them, asked whether she wished to climb. "I am not going to tell you to go," she said. "But I am also not going to let you ruin yourself for me. You will end your betrothal because it is dishonest, not because of me. You will tell Lady Sophia the truth, which is that you do not love her, and you will do it kindly. And you will do it before you ever touch me, because I have been the thing whispered about in one great house already in my life, and I will not be it in another." She stepped back from his hand deliberately, though it cost her. "When you are free, and only then, you may come and find me in this room, and ask me again. And I will give you a different answer." His hand closed slowly on the air where her cheek had been. "You are asking me to behave better than I wish to," he said. "Yes," said Eleanor. "It is what I am for, apparently, behaving better than one wishes to. I have a great deal of practice." The corner of his mouth moved again, that near smile, and he inclined his head. And he left the room as he had promised, and Eleanor stood alone among the cold books, with her heart going like a struck bell, and thought that she had just done the hardest and most right thing of her life, and that she would not have been able to do it a year ago. Before the debts, and the dead father in the emptied morning room had taught her exactly what she was worth, and exactly what she would not sell. The ending of the betrothal was a quiet, expensive, decorous affair, conducted between solicitors and over the heads of the principals, as such things were. The Duke, however, insisted on one thing the lawyers thought unnecessary, which was that he speak to Lady Sophia himself, alone, before the documents moved. Eleanor was not present. She knew only that the interview took place in the morning room, the same room where Augusta had met her reckoning, and that Lady Sophia came out of it, not white and rigid as the aunt had, but composed and thoughtful, and that she paused in the hall where Eleanor stood pretending to dust a shelf of figures she had no business dusting. "You are the companion," Lady Sophia said. It was not a sneer. She said it the way one identifies a card one has been trying to place. "I am," said Eleanor. Lady Sophia studied her. The plain gray dress, the chapped hands, the steady eyes. "It told me there was no one," she said. "I knew it for a lie even as he said it, because no man ends a thing like ours. For no one. I have wondered all week who the someone was." A small breath, almost amusement, almost rue. "I confess I expected diamonds. Not a girl who dusts the ornaments she could not afford to break." She drew on her gloves, finger by finger. "I am not sorry to be released. I will tell you that, because I think you are the sort of person who would rather know. I was raised for a position. I was never raised for him. I do not think anyone troubled to ask whether he might wish to be more than a position to someone." She paused at the door. "Be more than a position to him. It is, I find, the only thing he wanted, and the only thing none of us were ever taught to give." And she went out to her carriage, and Eleanor stood holding a small porcelain shepherdess she did not remember picking up, and found that her eyes were wet for a woman she had been prepared to think her enemy. The Duchess, restored to her rooms and her income and her son, grew visibly younger in the warmed house, and she took to Eleanor with the fierce attachment of a woman who has been alone too long and has decided late exactly whom she will trust. She would have it that Eleanor read to her instead of to Lady Marsh, and she would have it that Eleanor dined with her. And when the household began to murmur that the companion was rising above her station, the Duchess fixed the household with a gray eye and observed that she had recently had cause to consider what a station was worth. And the murmuring stopped. She knew, of course. Mothers know before, sons say. She had seen the gray hour in the library written on both their faces, and had said nothing, because she had learned the cost of letting others arrange a life, and she would not arrange theirs. Still she watched and she waited, and she hoped, and she made of her hoping a small, warm room that Eleanor was always welcome in. It was the Duchess who gave Eleanor the gift. Near the end, she sent for her one afternoon and put into her hands a small flat package wrapped in linen, and when Eleanor unwrapped it, she found a book of music, old, foxed at the edges, the songs her mother had played. "I cannot give you back your pianoforte," the Duchess said. "I made inquiries. It was sold on to a family in Bath, and they will not part with it. And quite right, too, for it is a sweet little instrument, and they have a daughter who loves it. Yet there is a pianoforte in the long gallery that no one has touched since I was a bride, and I should very much like to hear my mother's songs in this house again, for they are your mother's songs too, I find, which is a strange and kindly thing." She closed Eleanor's fingers over the book. "Play for me. Lady Marsh sleeps through it. I never shall." Eleanor played. In the long gallery in the late afternoon light, with the Duchess in a chair, and the dust sheets pulled off the old pianoforte, she played the songs she had thought she had sold along with the instrument, and found that they had been in her hands all along, waiting, the way some things wait in a body for the room safe enough to let them out. And she did not hear the Duke come to the gallery door. She did not know he was there until the song ended, and the last note hung in the cold, bright air, and a voice behind her said low and level and unmistakable, "I am free." She turned on the stool. He stood in the doorway in the late light, no longer at the gray hour, no longer in secret, his mother 3 feet away, and the whole house able to walk past the open door, and he had chosen it so, the openness after a life of closed rooms. He crossed the gallery. He did not stop an inch away this time. He took her face in both his hands, the chapped, music-warmed face of the girl who dusted ornaments she could not afford to break, and he said, "I am free, and I have come to find you in this room, and I am asking you again." And Eleanor, who had given him a different answer to expect, gave it. "Then yes," she said. "Julian, yes." He kissed her in the long gallery in the full light of the afternoon, with his mother smiling into the fire and pretending to see nothing, a kiss soft and slow and full of every gray hour that had built to it. And when it ended, he pressed his forehead to hers, and they stood breathing the same air. And the old pianoforte's last note seemed somehow still to be sounding in the room, the way a struck bell goes on under hearing, long after the ear has lost it. They were married in the spring in the small church at Wexmere, with the village in the pews and no diamonds anywhere, and the Duchess in the front row in a gown of soft dove gray. Chosen, she said, because she had grown fond of the color and meant to reclaim it from those who had used it to insult her. Lady Sophia sent a letter of good wishes that was warmer than courtesy required, and was answered in kind. Lady Augusta was not invited and did not write, and her name in time became one of those names a family does not so much forbid as simply cease to have occasion to say. On the night of the wedding it snowed, late and soft, the last snow of the year, and Eleanor stood at the window of the rooms that were now hers, the Duchess's old rooms made over and warm, and watched it come down over the dark gardens. Julian came and stood behind her, and put the folded letter into her hands, his father's last letter, the one he had carried against his heart through Vienna, and through grief, and through the whole long cold of his not feeling. "I want it kept where the family keeps its true things," he said. "I have carried it alone long enough. I should like it carried by us." Eleanor opened it. She had never read it. The hand was an old man's hand, and what it said was simple, a father asking a son to come home before the winter, to sit by the fire to let the estate run itself for a season, because a man's family was the only thing that did not keep. "Come home before the winter," it ended. "The house is cold without you in it." She folded it again and laid it in the small drawer of the writing desk where she understood it would now live, no longer pressed against one man's heart in secret, but kept in the open by two. And she turned in the circle of her husband's arms and looked out at the falling snow and the warm-lit windows of the great house that had once turned the Duchess from its door, and now would not turn anyone. And downstairs someone, the Duchess perhaps, was playing the old pianoforte. Picking out one of the mother's songs slowly and a little wrong and entirely without fear, and the house was cold no longer, and there was, at last, someone in it. If this story warmed you on a winter evening, stay a moment in the quiet of it before you go, and if you found something of your own in Eleanor's long way home, you might tell me so, for stories like hers are kept alive by those who carry them on. The snow fell, the song went on, and somewhere, in a warm room, a folded letter rested in an open drawer, carried now, as the old Duke had asked, by the family that had finally come home before the winter.